everyone, this is Marila from Marcus Evans. Thank you all for joining today's webinar, Omnichannel Excellence in Pharma, Aligning Teams and Strategies for Similar Engagement, brought to you in partnership with Merge. Before we begin, I would like to cover a few housekeeping items. As you can see, at the bottom of your screen are multiple application widgets that you can use. All the widgets are resizable and movable, so please feel free to move them around. If you have any questions during the webinar, please submit them to the Q&A widget. We will try to answer as many questions as possible. However, if we run out of time, we'll make sure to answer to you by email. If you have any issues during the connection, please click on the help widget. It will help you navigate more. Also, we added some resources and helpful links if you wish to download or bookmark them. At this point, I will introduce our fantastic moderator, Pat McGoyle, Managing Director, Health and Life Science at Merge. Pat, you may take the stand.
All right, thank you, Marilia, and thank you everyone for joining us for another exciting discussion about Omnichannel. I have, for those of you who participated in the fall, I've got our great speaker back, Brooke Fleming, and I'll let her introduce herself. And then we also have another member of the Merge team, Becky Minervino, who oversees our experience service offering, and I'll let her introduce herself in a moment. But for those of you who I don't know, Pat McGloin, I'm the Managing Director of the Health Division here at Merge, and looking forward to a great discussion here today. So why don't we start with the introduction of the rest of our guests. Brooke, go ahead and introduce yourself.
Good afternoon. Thank you for having me, Pat and Becky. Brooke Fleming. I'm currently at Sage Therapeutics. I head up our orchestrated customer engagement group, and I am excited about this topic. It's one of my favorites, so I'm looking forward to getting into it.
And I'm Becky Minervino, here for Merge. I've been here for 12 years. Heading up experience means helping our clients understand who they're designing for and how to design for them well. So Omnichannel is very much front and center, and I'm really pleased to be able to join Brooke here with you today, Pat.
Excellent. All right, well, why don't we just get right into it? We're gonna start with a little poll question to get the creative juices flowing. We'll start with, how mature is your organization's current omnichannel customer engagement strategy? Would you say you're at the beginner level, intermediate level? Go ahead and answer the survey there, and then we'll take a look at the results in a few seconds.
I feel like we need the Jeopardy music.
Feel free to hum. All right, let's see where we're at. Okay, so we've got a nice mix here, but many are on the beginning phase of the journey, which is great, and that will help us to really tailor our conversation appropriately, because we've kind of worked with folks at all ends of this journey, and it is a journey that never ends. So why don't we start with the beginning? What piece of advice would you have, Brooke, for folks who are just starting on this journey?
Ooh. You know, Pat, you and I talk about this a lot, but I think the commitment at the highest level, of the organization is critical, because it really is a marathon and not a sprint. So knowing that everything isn't going to happen in a calendar year or fiscal year, it's really important. So just like managing your own expectations, getting ready for the ride that this is going to be, and buckle up because it's definitely something that's, should be road mapped out, and you need patience, right? We always talk about iteration, and I think iteration is the key to innovation, especially if this is something you've not done before. So just be patient and know that this is definitely going to take a bit of time.
Awesome, that's great advice. Becky, any thoughts you'd like to add on that topic?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, as we've talked about, Brooke and Pat, for a lot of organizations, historically, they tend to be, it's normal to have a design that's related to your area of focus, like your channel organization, as opposed to being organized according to customer needs or customer portfolios. And so that's a big shift. We're not saying you need to change your org design in order to make this happen, but realize that you're going to be working in a different way. So changing org design is definitely helpful.
I'm an advocate.
It's a new way of working. It is not necessarily just a new tactic that you get to plan and execute it in a short time frame, as Brooke is saying. So I think you need to approach it differently than turning on a different channel, like to your media mix, for instance. So having that long view is important.
Absolutely. And, the only other point I'd add there is just, from a mental model perspective, it's thinking in terms of systems instead of silos. And I think, the organizations are so well structured around being able to deliver in a repeatable way within those silos. But for omnichannel to work effectively, building consensus across those silos so you can really think about it in terms of a system that's surrounding your customer is so critical.
Yeah, I like that. Systems over silos. And I like what you just said, Becky, about it not being a tactic. Like, this isn't a channel. It's an entirely, different way of working, especially if you are just accustomed to just like turning on one thing at a time. This will definitely put it's a paradigm shift for sure. So I like that a lot. It's true. And I am an advocate of maybe you have to change the way you've been working internally from an organizational perspective. So if the structure needs to change in order to do what's in the best interest of the customer, then it might be a consideration.
Yes, I fully support that.
Let's go to the next question. But before we go to the next question, let's go through a little overview of how we like to think about designing these seamless and connected experiences. It's really, thinking in terms of this system, as we said, and we look at it more almost like an infinity loop, because that journey never ends, right? And ideally, as Brooke said, you're constantly iterating over time and you're building on those foundational elements that you put in place. In today's discussion, we're going to spend a lot of time on the 9 o'clock position of this slide, which is really thinking through the actionable journeys that we create in order to design for those customer experiences. But as we think from a systems perspective, we look at how all of these activities are connected, right? And they're interconnected, whether it's like understanding that journey and designing for that journey, what channels are required to meet the customer where they're at within that journey, what content is required and the sequencing of that content, what's needed there in order to be as relevant as possible. And then how are we driving them to our owned properties so that we make sure they're converting at the most effective rate possible. So really just thinking from a systems perspective when you're starting on this omnichannel journey. Any thoughts to add here before we move on to the next question? All right. Which aspect of customer experience represents your biggest challenge? Understanding customer journeys or aligning internal teams?
I love this question, you guys. Because it changes. The answer will change depending on where you are in your maturity, right? It won't be the same each time.
Yeah, we probably should have included all of the above. Yeah. Oh, there we go. Interesting.
Okay.
Wow. I didn't expect this one.
Me neither, yeah. Or at least so much uniformity, yeah.
Yeah, I didn't expect this one. Can I say what's interesting about this?
Sure.
Out of the 4 options that are here, and it might just be because I've been doing this a while, but out of the 4 options that are here, this is the, I guess, the more low-hanging fruit for me. But I do say that it's the biggest challenge in terms of getting people from a change management perspective sort of shift the way that they think and operate. So maybe that's what the majority of the folks who took this, who chose this answer, maybe that's what they're thinking, because the actual sort of work of integrating the touch points themselves, I feel like it's like a lighter lift than maybe the idea of having people who are specifically focused on our sales professionals or like the medical sales liaisons or some of those other folks who are touching the customer one-to-one. And then the folks who are like maybe traditionally working on non-personal promotional type things, like the more traditional marketing efforts that are, print and other things. But I think this is interesting.
So you mentioned that you feel like in some ways it's low-hanging fruit. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Well, so you guys know I look at things from a purpose, plan, and platform perspective. So in the terms of the planning, right? So the purpose is what are we trying to do? Like, what's the objective of all of the work that we're doing from a brand level? The plan is, operational planning, putting all that stuff down on paper and figuring it out. And I think during that part of the process, it's really, especially if you've already gone through the process of understanding what you're doing from a communications perspective and what you're saying. And it's the idea of being able to have consistent messaging across channel, inclusive of your sales rep, is easily considered on paper, right? Like it's easily like thought about when you're putting those frameworks together. But then when we start to think about the platforms, platforms that talk to each other help with this, right? So if you've got a Viva that your say your sales professionals are likely using on an iPad, then you've got some internal platforms, maybe something in Salesforce, could be something else, but it's easily integrated in terms of being able to pull those things together and having something inform and or recommend and or trigger like what's happening in that next in the next position that's sort of coming up for the customer. Those things are easily tied together if they are intentionally designed to be that way. I can see there being challenges if you, to your earlier point in the opening, Pat, are thinking in a very siloed way, right? So if like everything is sales rep and you didn't consider all of the other opportunities where a customer will then engage with the business, then this would be a challenge. But because experiences, regardless of what type of strategy they're being executed through, whether it's single channel or omni-channel or multi-channel, all experiences need to be intentionally designed together. And so if you don't intentionally design them, if you don't go through the process of like considering continuity of messaging and continuity of creative, you're going to probably have a problem because we have to be considerate, right? Like we're all people and we have work, but we also have home and shopping and kids and family. And so we're inundated with lots of things. And I think from a saturation perspective, we have to be conscious of that as well when we think about our customers. And so I'm just I'm a fan of doing the intentional design part, right? Like we have to design them first and then it's easy. And I say, I use air quotes with the easy, but you know what I mean? Like just be thoughtful and considerate about all of those main touch points and how they touch and talk to each other. And I think it should be fine. But it's hard if you don't think about it.
This is true. Becky, thoughts on maybe how to connect those dots?
Sure, yeah. I mean, this is where the ineffable journey map comes into play. I think that it's a label that gets used in a lot of different ways, and maybe people have had some frustrating experiences sometimes with journey maps because it's about the process and how it enables shared understanding and decision making more than it is about the one artifact. The artifact is important. We need to do that well, but it's really about how to go about that process of gathering those outside-in points of view, making sure we're looking at it from the clinician's point of view of like, I need to make a decision quickly. I don't have much time, and where should I go next? And if you're not making it simple and consistent, then we're adding, friction to the process. And I think it takes a little bit to step back and remember that we have to look at it from, whether it's the patient or the caregiver or the clinician standpoint. But, we're in a time when patience has become even in shorter supply than attention spans. Like people it's a big challenge. We all face this. You know, how many devices is everyone on this call looking at right now while they're eating their lunch and like trying to multitask? None.
I've got 10. This is 10. I've got 10 devices right here.
And we need to design for that world. So like getting everyone aligned on the nature of the problem and how it lands on the people we're trying to support. You know, I'll use clinicians since that's a common, prescribers are something that we're often trying to influence with our work. But whoever it might be, and helping, the NLS people, the sales teams, the marketing teams, all rally around that shared outside-in understanding. Even if they all think they know, we haven't had that shared. If you haven't had that shared conversation recently about what's going on, it can really help jumpstart a more unified way of saying, like, well, what do we want that desired future state to be versus the very troublesome gaps there might be in earning someone's attention or helping them put somebody on therapy later once they've made the decision. Really trying to have that, starting with that shared understanding of the problem to solve, and by looking at the experience from your end user standpoints of prescribers or patients.
And it's hard, right? Like internally, that's hard to do. It's not because there's a lot to be. I want to be fair in saying that there's a lot to be done, especially like even if your brand is not launching, it might be a product that's well along its life cycle, but it's still hard to do because your customer's always changing, and this doesn't work if you haven't considered who that customer is at this given point in time. This doesn't work if you are using outdated data, right? Like that's why you've always just got to be listening and paying attention to what your customers actually want now. Right. Because what worked before will be even less, it won't be effective now, especially if you're 2 years, 3 years, 4 years out from when you initially launched, et cetera. It's just you have to always be paying attention and always collecting and maybe even tucking things away for later in terms of insight, because you might not need it immediately, but going back to the idea of planning this, like it'll come up and you'll need it. Yep. You might have to take some deviations from what you initially thought, but you'll have something to support that decision. And I think that's what's most important.
Yeah, I think that's wonderful. Go ahead, Pat.
No, go ahead. No,
I was going to say, just the way that you approach the work in terms of the self-awareness of like, how do we know this? Should we act on it now? What don't we know? What should we know? And, not to paralyze the process in terms of overanalyzing it, but being very self-aware and comfortable with, we know this well, let's act on this versus we need to better understand this or revisit it. And I think that growth mindset is another important dependency for effective omnichannel work.
We need that on a t-shirt.
Yeah.
Growth mindset is a dependency is needing to be printed.
That's awesome. Yeah, and the only thing I would add to that is, I'm just thinking from if I put my former client hat on, so I was like head of commercial ops and life sciences before I came to Merge a little over a decade ago. And, in running into some of these challenges that I think folks are hinting at with their response here in this question, I think two things come to mind. One, you want to make sure that there's a commitment from sales leadership into utilization of the tools that you're putting in place, because for really to have those integrations between your non-personal promotion and your personal promotion, it does require commitment from the field sales organization to input that information and use that information. And so that commitment kind of comes from the top. So I would work to make sure you have that support from sales leadership. And the second piece that I think is important, and maybe this can help you get that support, and that is think of the sales force as a participant in the journey.
Absolutely. So 100%. Yes. Yes.
So how are you designing this system to meet the needs of the sales force so they can be more effective at getting appointments, closing the sale? What are we doing to design this system to deliver for them? And then ultimately that will allow the system to deliver for their constituents. So those are the only two other points I'd add there.
I really like that.
Yeah, that's great.
That's why we get along, Brooke, I think. All right, so let's talk a little bit more about the journey. Now, how do you define the customer journey, and why is that critical for omnichannel success? Who wants to take that first?
Becky, do you want to go first?
Sure, yeah, that's fine. I mean, the simplest way I can think about it is it's a shared understanding of who you're designing for, all of those people, and what they need across that experience. So there are a lot of elements to it. You want to know what people are, their actual behavior. You want to know what they're doing, thinking, and feeling. And you want to boil that down to what their leading needs will be across that experience, along with the resulting opportunities for, for the brand that you're working to support. In some ways, it sounds really simple. People, but obviously what people say and what they do is not always aligned. So you have to be, you have to really be thoughtful about how you get that information so that it is reliable. It's one of those, ineffable, like garbage in, garbage out concerns of, if we're going to build the journey map as a center source of truth, we need to have some confidence that it's going to be, we're building on solid ground. So that shared understanding of people you're trying to support across, it could be across almost any kind of experience. So often we're talking about prescribing or adhering, and having those different lanes for what that person's doing over that experience, and then the punctuation of like what they're really needing, what are the leading barriers, and what are the resulting opportunities can open up a lot of ideation after that, which is the whole point.
I think, and I was just having this conversation recently with someone, so I think this is such an interesting question, but when we think about attitudes and behavior and beliefs, and then behaviors, right? Like they don't all take the same effort to move.
True.
And you're not going to be able to invest all of your dollars in all the places. And so you need to make some decisions. So are we, especially when I'm going to separate this from blueprinting, but customer journey mapping specifically, because this is the customer sort of facing document, the thing that you're putting together, that's identify who your customers are and how you're moving them along.
Yeah.
You would have needed to have decided at a brand level, what are you moving them along to do? Are you trying to change a behavior, or are you trying to change an attitude about the brand, the process, the device, whatever it is? And because those don't take the same effort, and they also don't take the same investment typically. And so I agree with everything that you said. I just think that we have to decide early on in the process from a strategy perspective, what are we trying to move? Are we committed to doing that with our investment, with our content, with our time, with our resources, organizationally? And are we going to stick to it in the long run? Because it's going to take like emphasis and re-emphasis and iteration. It's going to take all of those things. And so you've got to decidedly say, and in a sort of full-throated way, we want to change this belief. We want to change this, or we want to change this behavior, and everything that we do tactically and everything that we turn on from a platform perspective supports the idea of shifting that belief or shifting that behavior. Because I think we often see, because people are like, how are we going to be successful with this? Where you're not going to be successful if you all don't have the same end in mind or the same goal in mind. And you're not going to be successful if you quit halfway through because it doesn't look good, because it can get messy. So agree with everything you said, but just wanted to add on in the planning part and the strategy piece, like really defining early on, like how you want this path, this journey to go, like how well you want this to pan out, because we're all on the same page about what we're trying to, get the customer to do, to believe, to think, whatever it is.
I love the intentionality that you're underscoring there. And I think it's one of the reasons why you have been so successful in your past, in that a strategy that doesn't have some sense of trade-off of like, we could be doing all of these things. We know these are all problems that real people have that we could try to solve for, but which ones should we pursue based on lots of different factors, and feasibility and alignment are two of the biggest ones. And so having that vibrant discussion at the beginning, especially, you know, during grand planning season or annual planning overall, so that you can commit and that you're not fragmenting your efforts, I think is really critical, and too often is overlooked. You know, there's a polite disagreement and then we're just gonna keep going. And you're right, it's a marathon, not a sprint, so that will come back in a way that's not welcome.
I know. Never stop planning. There's a brand planning season, but never stop planning. Just keep planning. Always something.
I think the only thing I'd add to that is, and I think it's kind of a punctuation to your point, Becky, is like we like to look at it in terms of impact feasibility, right? Like, so what's the impact of what we want to do and how feasible is it? And how do we stagger those in a way that are going to allow us to get some quick wins to help build that momentum, so that we're not just going after all the home run wins and maybe getting tired halfway along the journey because, you know, the home run wins take a little longer to get to. So just making sure you have those quick wins peppered in, I think, is a good way to help build organizational momentum.
Yeah, absolutely.
So
really fast, Pat, because we talked about this off camera before. I just thought it was the perfect time to bring it up here. But you just said doing the best thing, but for who, right? Like we do oftentimes need to shift our paradigm from being company focused to really being customer focused. And that means that we have to shift how we determine what good looks like in terms of success here. Because obviously we want to see a return for what we're doing as it relates to the success of the brand. But I do think that there's a traditional way that typically happens. And I do sometimes believe that this approach requires us to change how we think about the traditional and reframe a bit. So I just wanted to punctuate the need to shift the way we've been doing things, because it's not going to work if we're doing things the same and expecting things to be different on the outset.
So true. Let's shift gears a little bit, because it sounds like embedded in that last whole question was maybe some thoughts around cross-functional collaboration. Who would you say needs to be involved in journey mapping, and how do you ensure there's alignment across teams? Brooke, do you want to start first with that one?
Yes, but I need you to repeat the question. It got loud on my side.
So when you're thinking about embarking on this journey mapping process, from a cross-functional perspective, who you find to be really helpful in engaging early on in that process, so that you can ensure that there's that alignment, given that we do need to get people out of their silos and maybe thinking a little differently about how they deliver for the customer?
Well, early on, like super early, this is going to probably sound weird, but it's probably going to be my market research colleagues. Because I think it's really important, and people are more receptive typically when we're starting from a place that's insight driven. And so I like to start collecting those early and often, especially, you know, because people are accustomed to doing things a certain way. And so you kind of need to bring a little proof to the conversation so that you have, you know, something to anchor to. So I would likely want to start with my data science and my market research colleagues early, and kind of get that the story, the framework for the plan together with them. Because then I think it's easier to then see the way along with our other colleagues, right? Because typically you'll want to try to touch hands with everybody who touches the customer.
Yes.
But you won't always gain consensus or alignment. Sometimes you just need to educate and upskill. But you always have to have that plan in mind, right? So do the planning first and then figure out the best way to bring people along based on where they sit in the organization. I think it's smart. I don't think the idea is to get everybody to always say yes right away, because that's just going to have you sort of swirling and circling in endless meetings. And that's not the objective, right? The objective is to put together a cohesive and comprehensive plan that we can all work around and agree, like, we at least know that we all have the best interest of the business in mind, and we're all going to be good brand stewards. So let me get that down, and then I'll figure out my approach, because I don't think everyone's, not everyone's made the same, right? So we need to figure out individualized approaches for bringing people to the table, so we can have those integrated conversations.
Becky, any thoughts to add there?
Yeah, I mean, I would just underscore, the importance of, as we're talking about designing with and designing for sales, along with, as Brooke said, ideally anyone that is customer facing with regards to whichever customers you're talking about touching, because in modern omnichannel marketing, a number of the problems will be communication problems, but a lot of the other more intractable ones will be experience ones. And being able to identify roadmaps that aren't necessarily in a traditional communication or narrow marketing bucket is really important for us to be successful. It doesn't matter if we change people's perceptions, for instance, if they're not able to get on therapy later. So how do we align everyone on the nature of where the problems are and how to prioritize them, and then work together, cross-functionally. And so bringing folks into that process, I agree with being insight-driven, outside in, but can help build that consensus, at least, or shared accountability, I guess is the way I would say it, rather than consensus.
Excellent. So we got a question from the audience here. What would you say is the most important factor for driving engagement through an omni-channel approach?
Muting myself. I think it's at least for me, it's like a clear and focused understanding of who you're talking to and what you're going to say. And I say this respectfully to all of my multi-channel warriors and my surround sound warriors. You cannot say everything to everybody the same way all the time through the same channels at the same time. And all you've done essentially is incorporate variable content wherein you changed, each doctor's names in an email perhaps, or that is not going to work for this. You really do have to spend some time going back to the whole idea of data, knowing who you're talking to, whether you decided to go the segmented approach, whether you decided, we're going to stick to archetypes and personas that we've grouped together, these lookalike cohorts, but we know what the key barriers to prescribing are. We know what the key barriers to engagement are, and we've made our message platform fit those groups that we've identified, and we're going to actively engage with them, saying the things that we know remove those barriers, and providing people things within their preference and affinity through channel. Not everyone has a problem with email, but some people do. And if you found that the specialty that you're focused on, they don't really like email, stop sending them that. Don't send them that, and engage with them in other ways that research has shown you works for them. So I really just believe starting out with the content and knowing who you're talking to is going to be key critical. It won't really work otherwise. I think we do ourselves a disservice by treating everyone the same.
Yeah, I think it's way too easy for people, because omnichannel does in the modern right person, right place, right time, right moment, like you tend to immediately think about the tools very oftentimes of like, oh, well, what do I need to have in place in order to make that happen? And those are necessary, as they say, necessary but not sufficient unless you've got that insight at the beginning. You have the right tools to send the wrong message.
Yeah, exactly. Like it's really shifting the mindset from the historical kind of one-to-many approach, where you're kind of shouting and hoping someone's listening, but you're shouting in sort of a generic way, right? to a one-to-one approach, right? And for a one-to-one approach to be effective, you have to start thinking about personalization at scale and designing personalization at scale, and personalization requires a deep understanding of your target audience. So how are we going to show them that we know them through the actions that we take, whether it's the channel considerations or the content or the sequencing of the content? How do we make that as relevant as possible? It's kind of like, I like to equate it to, think of the brand as a person. And if you met a person on the street who was just shouting the same thing all of the time, it'd be a fun relationship, right? Whereas if they showed you they knew you by the way they engaged with you, and talked to you about things they knew were relevant to you, then you'd have much more of affinity toward them. And so, like, when we're thinking about designing these omnichannel experiences, thinking that way helps you make it more personal, which will ultimately help you make it more relevant for your audiences.
And I think it's okay to say in your organization, we're not there yet. We can't do this right now.
Right.
Because then be great at what you can do, or start the omnichannel journey small and do what you can, do it well, and then plan to scale. Just going back to this being a marathon, I just think that sometimes people want to eat, you eat a little bit at a time. Sometimes people want to eat the whole thing, and like, that's just not, it's not manageable. You can't handle it. And it shows in your engagements with people. And oftentimes, back to your earlier point, Becky, about patience being short, attention spans being short, when you have people's attention and then it's gone, you run the risk of never getting it back. So I think when you have it, you have to be a good steward of it when you have it, and do well by that customer so that you keep it.
Yep.
Such a great point.
So it could mean like picking, and maybe just to elaborate on that, like if you've got the chance to do a segmentation, that's a really good way to start, because it helps you have a more empirical understanding of where you're going to get value from, like who you should prioritize. If you have to have a more of a ad hoc pro forma, that's okay, but just be very intentional about who you're going to focus on first. You can pick one segment to start with, of who you're going to treat differently, how you're going to treat them differently, why you're going to treat them differently, and run a pilot that helps you identify, like, what is the incremental lift when I talk differently to this one group. Because it can be overwhelming. I understand as well the idea, especially personalization. People get very embrace it a lot, and then it becomes paralyzing. So I think a practical, it could be a moment in the journey, it could be a segment in that journey, and designing a proof of concept solution that's going to show the incremental lift will help develop that muscle memory, get the momentum. Because scaling that out to other segments is a systematic thing, but people get overwhelmed, I think, by thinking about how to have to do it at scale to start with.
Yeah, and I think one of the things that causes people to get overwhelmed is a great lead into our next question, which is, thinking about data as the foundation. How should brands think about data and its role in effective delivery of the promise of a journey?
Initially, I thought this was going to be an easy question. I think it's tough because it's everywhere. Like, there's always somewhere to collect information from, and the problem is that it used to be the problem was collecting the data. That's not the problem as I see it anymore. The problem now is knowing what to do with what you have. And knowing when to use it. I think there are inflection points in the process, the experience planning process, wherein we need to lean into data more heavily than other times, because I really do believe this is a bit of art and science in terms of like putting these plans together. But it's like, if it can't be fueled by data during the planning process, you should not do it. If you cannot collect something from it or give something to it, you should just not do it. If it just feels good, but no one can measure it, just like it, but don't do it. Like, it's just not, don't do it. I think it's just knowing what you have, knowing what you're in constant receipt of, and always be looking for something to enhance what you're trying to do because you've planned this out. I'm just not a big advocate of just having it and then just trying to use it all because you have it. It needs to be intentional, just like the rest of the plan. So that's my 2 cents.
That makes sense.
Any thoughts?
I think this is, I'd like to think about this in 2 ways. One is in an ideal world, you're able to aggregate your data in a way that's actionable, right? So you've got the remit, you've got the resources, you've got the partners that are helping you weave together disconnected parts. We know that that is no small undertaking, both in terms of the financial commitment and the duration, organizational alignment. So I think a lot of clients sometimes wonder, if I'm not ready I haven't made my business case to get a CDP yet, what do I do next? Like, it's not going to happen for me, or is there someplace I can start? And I think it's fair to talk about other ways you can use even third-party data, which, is not, we're in a first-party world where everyone wants first-party data, and I don't want to dissuade anyone from that, but you can start to treat different people in different ways using third-party data, especially IQVIA.
I can attest to that, and I am a fan. Yes, you can.
It's a buy before you build sort of solution, and it's very practical. Helps you. Claims data, you can be used in a responsible way that helps you connect appropriately with the right prescribers, and is often an important on-ramp, I think, for clients in our vertical who are looking to get started, but don't have the investment of a big CD product behind them.
No, that's great. That's great. And the only thing I'd add there is, to punctuate that point on third-party data, using that to help build some of those segments, using those prescribing behaviors to kind of have some insight into how those physicians may behave to certain messages, can really help at least make that first step forward toward a personalized engagement or a more relevant engagement. And that doesn't really require having that data set up yet, right? And the other piece is, as you start to look at the data that you're collecting, I think this is kind of a building on Brooke's point, think about where that data sits in the journey. And one of the things we like to do is map the channels and the data that's going to come from those channels to the points in the journey so that you get early signals as to how your target audiences are moving through that journey. They can give you insight as to where to intervene. If you see people getting hung up in certain spots, it's sort of an early warning signal of, there may be some needs for different messaging or different content to help that audience advance. So those are some of the other things to think through, and how you can be kind of scrappy as you're trying to leverage data and the data that's available to you. It looks like we got another question from the audience. Okay. Let me see. So, what are you doing to leverage data across the entire org so all stakeholders are aware and can support? It sounds like data can be in many different places, and people are looking at the data in different ways and leveraging the data in different ways. So thoughts on how to get the different stakeholders to appreciate the value of the data and how you're using it.
I think my hot take isn't going to be popular, right? Because I don't think we need to support it. So if we've got alignment on this journey, on this plan, and we are all at least aligned on what we need to do, I think, and this is where roles and responsibilities sort of come into play, right? Like, I think there's a level of trust that we have to have cross-functionally and within the organization to say, all right, we're on the same page, all hands in about the fact that we're doing this. And now we've got the things that we need to support it. But I think awareness of what we're using is hypercritical. It's super important so that everybody has the understanding. But I don't necessarily think, because there's always going to be 100 ways to do something. And so I think we have to just come back to the trust and the roles and responsibilities as it relates to implementation and pulling things through. So I think it's really about, okay, I understand where we are in this process. It looks like we're moving along as planned. Now, I do think there's opportunity to ask questions. I think there's opportunities to poke and probe and provide additional context if it's needed. But I think that needs to be as we're problem solving, as we're trying to remove internal barriers, as we're trying, if we run up against something that was unanticipated when it comes to the customer's experience itself. But I don't necessarily know that you need to sort of rally everyone around all the data. I feel like that's just additional layers of like murkiness that might keep you from achieving what you set out to achieve. And so I think being very focused and keeping your eye on the prize is super important. Don't get bogged down in sort of like the sort of heaviness of everybody's need to understand, because they won't. Everyone won't.
Yeah, I think it's very practical.
Yeah.
Yep. Yeah, herding the cats can be difficult for sure. So when you think about measuring success, what are some of the KPIs that you should focus on to know that you're starting to drive impact? Or when you're just designing according to the journey, maybe what are some of those leading indicators that might be important to help you know you're on the right path?
Sure. I think it starts with things that are more familiar to folks that, are maybe operating in a channel-based world, which is, basic engagement metrics. I'm saying this first because it starts there, but it should not stop there. In terms of, interaction rates, whether it's with an email or a website or downloading content. Up from there are conversion to more meaningful behavioral KPIs. So, what is the action you want them to be taking in terms of requesting sales contact, or ideally, more meaningful in terms of prescription lift, appointments or sample requests. Like those are the high value actions, obviously, that we're all here to ultimately drive. I'd supplement those behavioral things with attitudinal things. So you want to understand how easy it is for people to complete an action. So that can help you determine if there's friction that you could be taking out, or also perceptual measures. Do people regard you in the way that you want to be regarded, either from a service standpoint or overarching from a brand standpoint? So behaviors and outcomes and perceptions.
Yeah, my only punctuation point here is, stay vigilant about the signal to noise ratio, right?
Yeah.
Data creates a lot of noise. We have more ways to measure now than we ever have. And, sometimes with our data lakes and all of the data that we're collecting, how is this helping me be smarter about what action needs to be taken next, what I need to do next to diagnose or improve the process? And so I think taking some time up front to figure out what those KPIs are and which KPIs you're going to value more than others can help you as the journey is engaged to stay true to the things that you set out to measure success by.
Learning agenda development, measurement plan and development, you have to create those up front, and they're living documents, right? Like they should change as much as your plans change. They should get updated as much as your plans get updated. And don't let the data's outcome determine don't waver in the belief in your plan. Like if you believe your strategy is strong, tactics can change. Right. If the strategy is constantly changing, there's something inherently wrong with it.
Yeah.
So if you're constantly going back to the strategy, we've got a problem. But the tactics can change, and that measurement plan and that learning agenda can reflect that. And you choose wisely, put it together and choose wisely.
I think that also, just to underscore that point, the idea of having, your noisy data is a really important observation, Pat, that like you have to distinguish between the KPIs and the diagnostics. There's going to be a bazillion diagnostics. And your day-to-day teams need to be proficient in those to know, like, well, how could I change things? But the handful of KPIs that, like, the inevitable, you're in the elevator with the CEO, like, how's it going? Like, that set of KPIs needs to be brief and to the point, and don't conflate those two sets of data.
Amen.
Mm-mm.
All right. Let's see if there are any other questions in here that we haven't gotten to yet. Let's see. I feel like we touched on them all. Maybe I'll go back to some of my questions. And, I think working in the pharma space, privacy and compliance is critical. So with increasing privacy regulations, how can brands leverage the data ethically while still delivering these personalized experiences? That's a heavy one.
And a very long-winded answer too, but I think
well, we've got 10 minutes. So.
Well, you asked earlier who we should be partnering with. Your legal and your compliance colleagues and the folks who are putting together those privacy statements, those privacy policies, they're part of this team. Especially as cookies begin to change, as things start to change, like we've got to make sure that we've got updated language on customer facing assets, websites, even the print materials. All of those things need to be up to date, because you have to be very, very intentional about how you engage with people. And it has to be, when we talk about people's preferences for how they engage channel wise, we also have to be cognizant of how they engage from a consent perspective.
Mm-hmm.
You don't, again, once you lose them, they're gone for 12 months before you can legally re-engage them proactively. So do your best to work with those colleagues to be as open or as conservative about the language, so that you can get the first party data that we're all striving to have, and then continue to be, use it and do well with it when we are engaging.
Yeah. I think, that is so fundamental. And it's also, I think I want to really amplify what you're saying, Brooke, about making sure you're tuned in to your compliance team's understanding of the topic. Like, how much have their job is to manage risk, right? So, but the world does keep evolving. So to demonstrate your attentiveness to that, fundamental importance, and potentially shift the conversation to how can we be relevant and compliant, like those two things together. So you develop strategies that are not going to get anyone in trouble. And in a world where, attention spans are so limited, we're showing up in a relevant way, and being really resourceful about different ways to do that. So, first party data, zero party data, these things are going to help you because the requirements are more straightforward. It's permission based. As you say, consent driven needs to be in line with that, like how you're wording your consent forms. And, you can start really fundamentally, like you could be leveraging contextual personalization that's maybe a little less invasive first. You can talk about prescribers and non-prescribers, or prescribers in different settings, and that can still be meaningful. I don't think you should be intimidated to, like, say, I can't stop there. Like, start there. That can still deliver value and have it be a meaningful and more useful interaction with, things, but like analogous things for patients as well.
I think it's also important, and someone I think had asked, what can you do with a limited infrastructure? Can I just offer, read the contracts of the partners you choose to partner with. Read them well and negotiate them well, both on a media side and from a platforms and technologies perspective too, especially if you're not like doing your own, like to your point, Becky, CDP, someone might be doing it for you, or you don't have that, certain things might not be internalized. You'd be surprised, because data is so important nowadays. Like it could be to your detriment or to your benefit, the way that language appears in those contracts. And you may not even get to use it the way that you inevitably want to use it from your plan. If what's in the contract, just like as a mainstay for that partner, is written a certain way that doesn't help you. So I would just say, be very, like, that it's the boring stuff, but pay attention to the boring stuff in the upfront when you're like something might sound really great and it's exactly what you want, but read it. Can you use the data that's being generated for you by that party in the way that you all need to? And if, you know, an audit comes knocking, can you and that partner be happy with the outcome of the audit? Because even if you're the recipient of third-party data, you are the one who used it and then are therefore responsible for how that data was inevitably used. And on my side, that's extremely important, right? So in choosing media partners and choosing folks who are going to help you with your next best action solution and who are going to, I mean, and I think that's why I love Merge so much. It's because there's a level of responsibility and care that's taken to ensure that we're choosing things that make the most sense, not just for the moment and time that we're in, but long term as we want to take care of that data.
Wow, I feel like we should just end the talk there.
Oh, that wasn't even an intentional, you know, but it's true because audits can be scary. No one likes when they call. Right. They come call and they want to take a count. No thanks.
Yeah, exactly. For sure. You know, I would say kind of going back to our earlier topic about just staying true to the goal and having that North Star, you know, when you were thinking even about these compliance issues, begin with the end in mind, right? And so what's your opt-in language? If you're launching and you're doing an unbranded site, sure, you've dialed in your opt-in language to convert them to branded communications so that you're not setting up, you know, unintentional obstacles later down the road. So really just thinking through all those little details that can come back to haunt you if they're not thought through at the beginning of the journey.
Yeah, that's great.
Excellent. So I think that's all we have for content for today. Hopefully everyone enjoyed this as much as the last panel discussion we had.
I always have so much fun with you guys. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, thank you.
Back at you.
I want to also thank you panelists and thank the audience for tuning in one more time. Just to inform you, a survey will pop out on your screen. It's for Marcus Evans to know what you love today rather than our panelists, the discussion, the questions, and what would you like to know more? What other webinars would you like us to create for you so you can tune in and give us more questions? Thank you so much for your time, everyone, and enjoy the rest of the day. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.